The Isle of Saint Sigrid. As the ship approached the isle, the first thing that came into view were the twisted, rusted forms of the undead androids. Redbeard's stomach clenched at the sight, memories of his previous encounter with the creatures flooding back. But the Sisters of Pain were undeterred. Sister Lilith, Sister Isadora, Sister Sigrid, and Sister Gazelle stood at the bow of the ship, their eyes fixed on the shoreline as the androids came into view. Captain turned to the Sisters of Pain, hoping for some reassurance. "Don't worry, Captain," Sister Sigrid said with a fierce gleam in her eye. "We will handle the dead. You and your men focus on the living. Together, we can end this once and for all." Redbeard nodded, feeling a bit more at ease with the sisters by his side. He turned to his crew, barking out orders as they prepared to engage in battle. The time had come to face the horrors of the Isle of Undead Androids head-on. The androids had not spoken since their living parts died, and they had been left to roam the isle in a state of undeath, their electronic systems powering their lifeless bodies. They were a chilling sight to behold, their once human features twisted and distorted by the ravages of time and decay. They stood motionless, their cold, blank eyes seeming to stare through the living as if they were not even there. It was as if they had been left to wander the isle in a state of purgatory, waiting for the final release of death. As soon as the Sisters of Pain set foot on the shores of the Isle of Undead Androids, they began their prayers. They stood together in a circle, hands joined and eyes closed, as they called upon the goddess of death to aid them in their quest to bring the androids to their final rest. Despite the chaos and danger surrounding them, the sisters remained focused and resolute, their faith in their mission unwavering. As the sisters continued their prayers, the land of the dead manifested itself on the isle. The air grew thick with the presence of the beyond, and the souls of the damned emerged from the shadows, reclaiming their earthly remnants and joining the sisters in their battle against the androids. The ground shook as the ghosts of the fallen rose from the earth, their spirits fueled by the power of the sisters' prayers. The androids, caught off guard by this sudden manifestation of the beyond, hesitated for a moment before launching into a frenzied attack against the sisters and the souls of the damned. The souls of the damned were the spirits of those who had once inhabited the isle, but had been killed in the great war between humans and androids. Now, they were returning to reclaim their earthly bodies and fight for their final rest. The once silent isle was filled with the screams of the damned as they re-entered their former bodies, and engaged in a fierce battle for their right to rest in peace. The fight on the Isle of Undead Androids was going well for the Sisterhood of Pain and Redbeard's crew. The androids were clearly outmatched by the skilled warriors and the souls of the damned, and their attack had quickly turned into a desperate rout. But as the battle raged on, a bolt of dark lightning suddenly struck Sister Sigrid, knocking her to the ground. Redbeard and the other sisters rushed to her side, but it was too late. The bolt had been fired by a dark mage, one of the twisted practitioners of magic who had been using the androids for their own experiments. Redbeard let out a roar of anger and charged towards the dark mage. The mage, realizing he was outmatched, turned and fled, with Redbeard hot on his heels. The pirate captain was determined to catch the mage and make him pay for his treachery. As the few remaining androids retreated, the land of the dead and the souls of the damned began to fade away. The otherworldly energy that had sustained them dissipated, and they slowly vanished from the mortal plane. As Sister Sigrid lay on the ground, mortally wounded by the bolt of dark lightning, her fellow sisters rushed to her side. Her breaths were shallow and labored, and she struggled to hold on to life. "I was afraid," Sigrid whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was always afraid that I would die in my bed, old and alone. But at least I will die a hero, defending what I believe in." The sisters nodded. "You will die a hero, a keeper of the faith, and the martyr of the Isle, Saint Sigrid," Sister Isadora said softly, taking her hand. "And your sacrifice will never be forgotten." Sister Gazelle knelt down beside Sigrid, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "You have lived a full life, sister," she said softly. "You have fought for the goddess and now you will join her in the land beyond." Sister Lilith placed a comforting hand on Sigrid's shoulder. "You have served the goddess with honor and now you will be rewarded," she said. "We will remember you and all that you have done." Sigrid looked up at her sisters, a peaceful expression on her face. "I am at peace," she whispered. "I am ready to join the goddess." Sigrid closed her eyes and took her final breath, the light fading from her eyes as she passed on. As Redbeard and his crew followed the mage through the ruins of the isle, they could hear the dark mage's footsteps echoing through the empty halls. They knew he was getting closer and closer to escape, and they had to act fast. Redbeard led the way, his sword drawn and ready for battle. His crew followed closely behind, weapons drawn and ready to fight. They chased the dark mage through the twisted corridors of the isle, their footsteps pounding against the ground as they ran. Finally, they caught sight of him, his dark robes fluttering behind him as he fled into the shadows. Redbeard let out a fierce battle cry and charged forward, his crew right behind him. The dark mage turned to face them, a wicked smile on his face. He raised his hand, and a bolt of dark energy shot out, narrowly missing Redbeard and his crew. But they were not deterred, and they continued to close in on the mage. As the crew followed Redbeard in the chase, the dark mage began to panic. With a quick gesture, he cast a spell of darkness, enveloping the area in a thick, impenetrable fog. Despite their best efforts, the crew was unable to locate the mage, and he managed to escape and hide. Redbeard and his crew searched the island for hours, but the dark mage had vanished without a trace. "What do you suggest we do, Captain?" First Mate Jack asked, his hand on the hilt of his sword. The mage could be anywhere on this island, and with his powers, he could be hiding in plain sight. Redbeard scowled and paced back and forth across the room. "We'll have to split up and search the island," he said finally. "But we have to be careful. This mage is no ordinary foe, and he won't go down easily." "What about the sisters, Captain?" one of the crew members asked. "Can't they use their powers to find the mage?" Redbeard shook his head. "The sisters have already done enough. They have their own mission to attend to, and we can't risk their safety any further. We'll have to rely on our own skills and wit to find this mage and bring him to justice." "Understood, Captain," First Mate Jack said. "We'll do our best to find him and bring him to you." "Gentlemen," Captain Redbeard said gravely, "we must put Sister Sigrid to rest before we continue the search for the Dark Mage. He is trapped on this island and we have time to honor our fallen sister before we continue." First Mate Jack nodded in agreement. "Aye, Captain. Sister Sigrid was a fierce warrior and deserves a proper send-off." The rest of the crew murmured their agreement, and Redbeard nodded grimly. "Very well. We will hold a ceremony for Sister Sigrid and then continue the search for the Dark Mage. He will not escape us for long." The Sisters of Pain were still gathered around the body, their faces somber as they prepared to lay Sister Sigrid's body to rest. Redbeard stood with them, his own heart heavy with grief. "We must honor her sacrifice," Sister Gazelle said, her voice soft but steady. "She gave her life to protect us all, and we must show her the respect she deserves." Redbeard nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I'll help build the pyre," he offered. "She deserves the best send-off we can give her." Together, the group worked to build the pyre, stacking logs and branches to create a platform for Sigrid's body. Once it was ready, they placed her gently on top, covering her with blankets. The Sisters of Pain gathered around the burning pyre, their faces somber and tear-streaked as they watched the flames consume Sister Sigrid's body. As the flames grew higher, they began their ritual of flagellation, each of them taking turns to whip themselves as a sign of their grief and devotion to their fallen sister. The sound of the leather lashes hitting their naked flesh filled the air, a harsh and somber contrast to the crackling of the flames. As the fire burned, the sisters fell to their knees, their bodies battered and bleeding, but their hearts filled with the love and honor for their sister. The ceremony was a testament to the strength and devotion of the sisterhood, and a reminder of the sacrifices they were willing to make in the name of their faith. Thwack! 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 Whips spoke in unison. Gazelle looked solemn and determined. Her long, black hair was tied back in a tight braid, and her pale skin was marked with the red welts of the whip. The muscles in her arms were tense as she brought the whip down on her own back, the sound of it hitting her skin echoing through the air. Despite the pain she was enduring, her expression was focused and resolute, her eyes fixed on the pyre where Sigrid's body was being burned. She seemed to be in a state of deep contemplation, as if she were communing with the goddess and seeking strength from her. As she whipped herself, her movements were graceful and controlled, and it was clear that she was completely immersed in the ritual. The flagellation was a solemn and ritualistic ceremony, with the sisters taking turns lashing themselves with whip-like instruments as they prayed for Sister Sigrid's soul. Redbeard and his crew looked on with a mix of awe, horror, and sadness, respect for the sisters' devotion and grief for their loss. The ceremony lasted for hours, with the sisters' bodies covered in welts and their voices hoarse from chanting. As the ceremony came to a close and the sisters lowered their whips, their backs were a mass of raw, bloody flesh, but their expressions remained resolute. Finally, when it was over, the pyre had burned out, and Sister Sigrid's body had been cremated amidst a chorus of prayers and tears. "The final count is 125, Captain," Jack said to Redbeard as they watched the sisters complete their ceremony of flagellation. "That's one for every year of Sister Sigrid's life." Redbeard nodded gravely, his eyes fixed on the sisters as they finished their ritual. "That's my count as well." The search for the Dark Mage was long and grueling, as Redbeard and his crew scoured the island for any sign of the elusive villain. They searched through the abandoned factories and crumbling ruins, but they found no trace of the mage. They even enlisted the help of the Sisters of Pain, but even their keen senses were unable to locate the mage. As the days turned into weeks, it seemed that the Dark Mage had vanished into thin air. But Redbeard refused to give up, and he vowed to find the mage no matter what it took. He ordered his crew to continue the search, and they scoured every inch of the island in their quest to bring the mage to justice. But it was not until the darkness of night fell that the mage was finally found. As Redbeard and his crew prowled the shadows, they caught a glimpse of a hooded figure darting between the ruins. "Captain Redbeard," called out First Mate Jack, "I think I've found him." Redbeard and the rest of the crew rushed over to where Jack was standing, at the edge of a dark and shadowy cave. The Dark Mage was nowhere to be seen, but Redbeard could feel his presence nearby. "Where is he?" Redbeard growled, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword tightly. "I saw him duck inside this cave a few moments ago," Jack said. "He must be hiding in here somewhere." Redbeard nodded, his eyes narrowed in determination. "Then we'll just have to go in and flush him out. All of you stay close to me, and be ready for anything." With that, Redbeard stepped into the cave, followed closely by Jack and the rest of the crew. They could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing off the walls, and they knew they were getting closer to the Dark Mage. Finally, they came upon him, cowering in a corner of the cave. Redbeard approached him, his sword drawn. "You're not going anywhere," he said coldly. "It's time to pay for your crimes, mage." The Dark Mage looked up at Redbeard, his eyes filled with fear. He knew he had nowhere to run, and he knew his fate was sealed. "Do what you will with me," he whispered. "I am at your mercy." Redbeard looked down at the mage, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. It was a feeling he had not experienced in a long time, and he reveled in it. "You will be brought to justice," he said. "And may the gods have mercy on your soul." With that, Redbeard turned and led the way out of the cave, the Dark Mage in tow. It had been a long and difficult journey, but justice would finally be served. "First, we will have a chat." The captured Dark Mage was a tall, slender man with pale skin and sharp, angular features. His long, black hair was tangled and matted, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. He wore a tattered black robe adorned with intricate silver symbols, and his hands were adorned with silver rings set with dark, glowing stones. Despite his defeat, the mage seemed to exude a sense of power and danger, as if he could unleash deadly magic at any moment. Redbeard and his crew returned to the sisters with the captured Dark Mage. The mage was bound and gagged, his hands tied behind his back and his feet shackled. Redbeard and his first mate, Jack, roughly dragged the mage to the ground, securing him to the earth with thick ropes. The sisters watched with a mixture of curiosity and disgust as the mage struggled and thrashed, trying to break free of his restraints. "Giselle," Redbeard said gruffly as he approached the sister, "we've got the mage captured. What do you suggest we do with him?" Giselle's eyes narrowed as she looked at the captured Dark Mage, who was tied to the ground and struggling against his restraints. "We must interrogate him," she said firmly. "Find out why he and his guild seek to conquer the world. Only then can we defeat them for good." Redbeard nodded. "Agreed. But how do we go about it? I'm not one for torture, but we need to get information from him." Giselle's face softened slightly. "There are other ways to extract information, Captain. We could try using our faith to break through his defenses and get him to confess his motives. But if that doesn't work, we may have to resort to more extreme measures." Redbeard sighed heavily. "Very well. Let's try the faith first. If that doesn't work, we'll see what other options we have." As the dark mage was tied to the ground, Redbeard and Sister Gazelle stood over him, ready to begin the interrogation. Gazelle held a needle in her hand, the tip glowing with a faint, ethereal light. "Tell us what you know, mage," Redbeard growled, his voice heavy with anger. The mage sneered up at him, refusing to speak. Gazelle stepped forward, holding the needle to the mage's chest. "You will speak," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "The needle will show you the truth of the beyond, and the souls of the damned will guide you to speak the truth." The mage's eyes widened as the needle pierced his skin, and he began to tremble as visions of the beyond flooded his mind. The souls of the damned appeared before him, their haunting voices urging him to speak the truth. Redbeard and Gazelle stood in front of the dark mage, who was tied to the ground, his arms and legs spread out in a star shape. Redbeard had a needle in his hand, and Gazelle was holding a book of prayers. "Tell us your motives," Redbeard said, his voice cold and hard. "Why did you and your guild seek to conquer the world?" "Malthrax," the dark mage sneered. "Why does any being seek power and control?" "Because we believe ourselves to be superior to all others. We deserve to rule." Gazelle shook her head. "That is not a valid reason. You must have a deeper purpose, something that drives you to such destruction and evil." The mage sneered up at him, his eyes filled with hatred. "To plunge the world into eternal darkness, to cause starvation and suffering, and to raise the dead to serve us as an undead army," he spat out. Redbeard narrowed his eyes. "And how do you plan to do that?" The mage smiled slyly. "That is for me to know, and for you to find out." Gazelle stepped forward and placed her hand on the mage's forehead. "I will find out," she said, her voice calm and soothing. "Through the power of faith and the goddess, I will see into your mind and uncover your secrets." Redbeard nodded and pushed the needle into the mage's arm. "And if that doesn't work, we'll use more traditional methods." As the mage began to slip into a trance, visions of the beyond and the souls of the damned swirled in his mind. Gazelle began to recite her prayers, her voice growing louder and more intense as she delved deeper into the mage's consciousness. It was going to be a long night. Under the pressure of the needle and the souls, the mage finally broke, confessing everything he knew about the Guild of Dark Mages and their plans for world domination. Redbeard and Gazelle listened intently, taking note of every detail and promising to bring the mage's confessions to the other sisters. Gazelle crouched down next to Malthrax, her voice soft but firm. "You have a chance to repent for your actions, Malthrax. Tell us what you know and perhaps the goddess will show mercy on your soul." Malthrax let out a bitter laugh. "Mercy? From the goddess? She abandoned us long ago, sister. And as for my guild's plan, it is simple: we will plunge the world into eternal darkness, cause starvation, and raise the dead to serve us. And with the power of the throne of the eternal darkness, we will be unstoppable." Redbeard and Gazelle exchanged a grave look. Malthrax continued his confessions, revealing the plan for the conquest that had been formulated by Nefarian, the leader of the Dark Mages. "Nefarian is the one who came up with the plan to take over the world," Malthrax said, his voice shaking. He had been studying the ancient texts and discovered the secret of the Wand of Famine. He believed that if he could get his hands on that wand, he could use it to create famines and droughts that would weaken the other nations and make them more vulnerable to our attacks. Once we had control of the wand, we would use the undead androids to infiltrate and conquer the villages along the typhoon shore. From there, we would spread out and conquer the rest of the world, plunging it into eternal darkness. Nefarian believed that this would be the best way to ensure our survival, as the darkness would protect us from our enemies and the starvation would cull the weak from our ranks. Malthrax went on to describe Nefarian's obsession with the throne of the eternal darkness, an ancient artifact that was said to be protected by eternal darkness and to have the power to manipulate shadow and darkness. Nefarian believed that if he could get his hands on the throne, he could use it to raise the dead and create an army of undead minions that would be loyal only to him. He was convinced that this would give us the ultimate advantage in our quest to conquer the world. Malthrax's confession continued. Nefarian created the Wand of Famine and stole the throne of the eternal darkness from the shadow deities. He brought them both to the Tower of Exiled Dark Mages, where he plans to use them to conquer the world. He wants to be the ruler of a world filled with chaos and despair. As the torture came to an end, it was clear that Malthrax was losing his sanity. his eyes were wild and his words were jumbled, and he seemed to be struggling to keep his grip on reality. Giselle and Redbeard exchanged a concerned look, unsure of how to proceed. Malthrax, Giselle said gently, trying to get the Dark Mage's attention. We need you to focus. Can you tell us more about Nefarian and his plans? But Malthrax only stared at her, his eyes glassy and distant. Nefarian, he muttered. He's the one who created the Wand of Famine. He's the one who stole the throne of the eternal darkness. He's the one who's going to conquer the world and plunge it into eternal darkness. He's the one who's going to cause starvation and raise the dead. He's the one, he's the one, he's the one. Redbeard placed a hand on Malthrax's shoulder, trying to calm him. Easy now, Malthrax. We understand your loyalty to Nefarian, but we need you to tell us more. Where can we find Nefarian and the throne? But Malthrax only shook his head, his eyes filled with fear and desperation. I can't, he whimpered. I can't, he'll kill me, he'll kill us all. As the interrogation came to a close, the mage lay on the ground, exhausted and broken. Redbeard and Giselle stood over him, their eyes filled with determination to stop the Dark Mages and protect the world from their evil plans.